Hello everybody and welcome to the Dry Dock episode 282. This week the questions are taken from guides 352 and 353, that's on the Swedish coastal defence ships Gjetsin, I think, I possibly have forgotten how to pronounce that, and Aran, which is much easier to pronounce, along with Wednesday videos on the First Punic War and ship classifications in the Age of Sail, with a guest question from the Halifax Naval Museum tour. So with that said, let's get on with questions. But before we start with questions for this week, just a quick update to a question that was asked in a previous Dry Dock a week or two ago about mines and how you ensure that they are at the correct depth in various depths of water. And a couple of people reached out and pointed out that I'd neglected to mention a particular form of mine that was in use in the first part of the 20th century, and so I'll mention that here, and that is the plummet mine. So the plummet mine, if you've ever seen mines on a mine layer, or perhaps in a museum, you will see sometimes they're just on their own, and other times you'll see them sitting on what looks like a metal box. Now, this metal box is usually the anchor, and this type of arrangement is usually where you will find a plummet mine. Now, the way a plummet mine works is you have the mine sitting on the anchor, the box, and then you kick it over the side, and you have a plummet line, which hence the name, which is attached to said box, and that plummet line is set to the depth you want the mine to sit at. So let's say 20 feet. At this point, both the mine is buoyant and the anchor box is also buoyant because there's air in it. The plummet line pays out. It reaches, let's say, a 20-foot depth. And when it reaches that depth, it also mechanically opens up the anchor box to be flooded, so now the anchor box is negatively buoyant. It starts to sink. And then as it sinks, obviously at some point, the plummet line, which is weighted, comes in contact with the seabed. And then that line goes slack, and when that line goes slack, then that releases a clamp which clamps onto the mooring cable for the mine, which has been paid out as the anchor sinks and the mine itself has stayed on the surface. So now you have a situation where you have the mine on the surface, a now clamped in mooring line between it and the sea anchor and the anchor box is now 20 feet above the surface of the seabed. And then, of course, the anchor continues to sink because the mooring line is not being paid out anymore. That means the mine is dragged down, and thanks to the way the whole system works, it means that as long as you have a long enough mooring line, you can chuck mines overboard and they will, in theory, all sit at the preset depth you want them to be, in this case 20 feet. So thanks for people for pointing that out to me. Somehow I had forgotten about them, but now you know. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks an amendment to a previous question I asked and that you answered in Dry Dock 262. Between the Queen Elizabeth's Hood and Bismarck, which would benefit the most from going to triple turrets, I meant to say that you could make other modifications to them to accommodate this. They just had to retain the ABXY turret arrangement. Does this change your answer in any significant way? Okay, so if we're allowed to make revisions to the design, i.e. make the ships a bit beamier and therefore also need a bit longer, a bit more machinery, etc., but we're keeping the armour and target speed the same, in that case, I think the Queen Elizabeths probably could have benefited the most, partly because of their exceptionally long lifespan historically, and partly because of what that would have enabled. So, there's a lot of things that could be improved for any of the designs if they're upgraded and become larger to fit triple turrets instead of twins. But with the QEs, there's two very specific incidents or circumstances, I guess, where potentially huge differences could be made. First of all, is at Jutland, because if you're increasing the firepower of every single QE by 50%, by going from 8 guns to 12 guns, and they're keeping, as I said, their speed, protection, etc., then that means you essentially, when you look at the run to the south and 5th Battle Squadron showing up and the amount of damage they were able to do, you're effectively adding another 2 Queen Elizabeths to that equation in terms of absolute firepower, which makes it statistically significantly more likely that they will deal quite bad damage to the first scouting group, the German battle cruisers, which could have quite an interesting effect on the way that Jutland goes thereafter. And then obviously you've got the fact they're engaging at the lead portion of the High Seas Fleet as well. There's a lot of things that could be done, if you essentially say, well, what, in other terms, is the effect of adding another 2 Queen Elizabeths to that melee. But then you also have the fact that going forward, you presumably got these ridiculously large vessels compared to what they would be historically, but going forward in time to the 1930s, given that the hood design was sort of cribbed off of the QEs-Rs, there's a higher chance that Hood inherits triple turrets anyway, because the starting point is the QEs. But even if it doesn't, when you get to the 1930s and the modernizations that are undertaken, well, obviously for a start, having a 12 15-inch gun ship is going to be significantly more useful than having a 8 15-inch gun ship. But and this is obviously, for the sake of ease of argument, ignoring the massive knock-on effects that having a ship that large and that powerful would have on things like the Washington Naval Treaty, but regardless, what you might also find is that whilst the radical modernizations that were done to Warspite, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant didn't extend as far as removing part of the main armament, because ultimately a 6-gun ship does have some significant disadvantages, if you have a 12-gun ship and they're looking at, well, we need to modernize these ships to stay in the fleet for another 5-10 years, and everybody is restricted to 35,000 tons for their fast capital ships, and people are building things like Littorio, Bismarck, Richelieu, North Carolina, etc., it does lend a possible modernization route wherein you remove X-turret, the super-firing aft turret, and all its associated accoutrement, and extend the machinery spaces, because that might then allow you, with a few revisions to the hull, to push the ships up to 27-28 knots, i.e. make them competitive with modern fast capital ships, and at that stage, removing a single turret still leaves you with 9 15-inch guns, which is a very creditable armament, at which point you've just added 3 whole new fast capital ships to the Royal Navy's inventory for World War II, and that could make a huge difference to what then happens. Christopher Babylon asks, between World War I and World War II, did the Swedish Navy ever fire their guns in defence of their homeland or to defend the ships themselves? Not as far as I'm aware. About the closest you would have gotten would have been the whole Åland Island issue in 1918, in the latter stages of World War I, and several Swedish coastal defence ships did show up there to obviously support Sweden's interests in that particular dispute. But as far as I can tell, I don't think they actually actively shot at anybody. So that would be about the closest, I think. But to be fair, that's not really a mark against the Swedish Navy, because of course the best way you know a deterrent navy has succeeded is if it doesn't actually have to do anything other than deter things. If someone's actually attacking your deterrent navy, then a certain amount of your deterrence has already failed. Nikujaga Oishi, I think, asks, you compared Jeu Nicole with the Swedish approach of miniature capital ships in earlier videos and seem to consider the latter as a more practical doctrine, with a case study of the Kriegsmarine being cautious about the potency of the Sverige class. But why? Aren't the core concepts of the Jeu Nicole and the Swedish Navy in the 20th century pretty much the same, with the only difference in execution? wouldn't the Germans be reluctant to face loads of torpedo boats and a vastly superior opponent that can pretty much adapt to and overcome anything a navy that follows the Je ne Cole throws at it, which you suggest is the Je ne Cole's major flaw, can also do the same against these ships anyway? There are a few reasons why I consider the Swedish Navy's approach superior to the Je ne Cole idea. Firstly, the Swedish Navy strategy in the first part of the 20th century is a pretty much purely defensive approach, which has different strictures built into it compared to the Je ne Cole, which, whilst it has a defensive element, the Je ne Cole is ultimately an offensive approach. The Je ne Cole was designed, obviously, by the French to allow them to destroy the Royal Navy, even though France's economy and shipbuilding were in a position where they couldn't match the Royal Navy in a traditional battle fleet. And an offensive doctrine requires you to have ships that can fight battles that a defensive-only doctrine doesn't, like battles out on the high seas. And that's one of the areas where the Je ne Cole falls down, because the Swedish defensive doctrine, although it's anchored around miniature capital ships like the Sveriges and their predecessors, is an integrated and interlocking system which has some destroyers and torpedo boats involved. It has minefields involved. It has these small capital ships involved, and it has coastal defences, big coastal defence guns, all integrated into an overlapping network of defence, which is much greater than the sum of its parts. Whereas the Je ne Cole, with its pure reliance on torpedo craft and cruisers, and most of the cruisers are supposed to be out doing commerce raiding under absolutely pure Je ne Cole, physically is incapable of doing that. For one thing, the Je ne Cole doesn't even have something of a similar caliber to the Sveriges, which is a bit of a disadvantage. But secondly, if it comes down to a battle, if you're fighting in the open seas, if you're going on the offensive, which is what the Je ne Cole espouses you to be able to do, you can't have an integration with minefields because you're on the move. You can't have an integration with coastal defences because, well, they're back on your coast. And if you end up fighting a defensive war, then you lack the heavy firepower of a coast defence ship like a Sverige. You might have minefields, but the Je ne Cole doesn't really look into them quite as much as Swedish doctrine does. And it's that overlapping concept that really works, because yes, the Germans would be a little bit reluctant to face lots of torpedo boats, but the counter to lots of small, fast attack craft, apart from just having more small, fast attack craft of your own, is things like cruisers with rapid-firing guns, because they will outrange and outshoot the torpedo boats, the fast attack craft, and destroy them pretty easily. Or, going back to the late 19th century, secondary and tertiary and quaternary batteries on Brew dreadnoughts as well, and so on and so forth. And there's not really much of a reply the Je ne Cole has to that, because if you send in the cruisers of the Je ne Cole, then they're not doing commerce raiding. B, a commerce raiding configured cruiser is probably going to lose compared to a cruiser that's designed for straight up fleet combat. And 3, the cruisers are nice big targets for the battleships, which your torpedo craft are trying to sink. Whereas if you were to look at a swarm of torpedo boats, let's say in the Swedish context, if you sent in a light cruiser or several to try and deal with those, the Sveriges would be able to quite comfortably deal with those light cruisers. And if you sent in something big like a heavy cruiser or an armoured cruiser, depending on the time period you're looking at, the Sveriges can still challenge them, and the coastal defence guns will help out. And if you send in something really big, like a pre-dreadnought battleship or later on a dreadnought, then the Sveriges can still hurt them, the coast defence guns can still hurt them, and the minefields can channel them into areas where they are now at a disadvantage, and the torpedo-armed fast attack craft can leverage their weapons against them. Essentially, what it comes down to is that there are many possible responses to the Je ne Cole, and some of them are pretty simple. Like I said, either you just outbuild your opponent in the same classes of ships, or you can do that or match them and build counters like fast-firing cruisers and battleships with secondary batteries. And that's not difficult for a large navy to do. Whereas with the Swedish coastal defence doctrine, because as long as they're building coast defence ships and coastal defences, which pretty much stops by the 1920s, but as long as they're doing that, and as we see with the Kriegsmarine's evaluation, even with the legacy effect afterwards, the overlapping nature of having minefields, torpedo craft, big guns, larger ships, and even bigger guns on coastal defences means that there is no one easy counter to the Swedish doctrine. The only way you're going to get past the Swedish defensive doctrine is to throw what on land would be called a combined arms offensive against them, because you'll need your heavy ships to take out the coast defence ships and the coastal defence emplacements. You'll need your cruisers to deal with their torpedo craft. You'll need your own torpedo craft to potentially deal with the Swedish heavy ships before they do damage to your heavy ships, which compromise your ability to take out the coast defences. You need minesweepers, and you need more ships to cover the minesweepers, and so on and so forth, which means you're having to commit a very significant amount of resources from all sorts of vessel classes across the fleet to essentially just overwhelm an entrenched defence with numbers, which is going to be very costly. And yes, a very large navy could afford to soak those up, but that kind of requires you to have a very, very large navy comparative to the Swedish navy, whereas if all you have is a larger navy, like the Kriegsmarine had, it may not be worth it, because it may sap much of your, if not all of your strength to do so, and hence the deterrence effect has worked. Whereas, yeah, as I say, if Sweden had gone with a purely je ne colle style approach, the Kriegsmarine, well, obviously there's other political factors and etc. as to why Germany doesn't go after Sweden, but the Kriegsmarine's evaluation almost certainly would have said, yeah, we can deal with that, not really much of a problem. I mean, hey, a Swedish je ne colle style defence, you might actually have found a use for the Königsbergs. Matthew Griffiths asks, lots of UK science museums I've been to have large ship models in glass cases. How, if at all, do you spot submerged torpedo tubes on the models? Well, of course, it depends on the fidelity of the model, but most of the big ones that you find in museums are usually builders' models or similar, like this one of HMS Doris, an Eclipse-class protected cruiser, which you can find in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich in London. And assuming it's a relatively high-fidelity model, then you look below the waterline for a hatch-looking object. So in this particular case, you can actually see it relatively clearly, albeit it's a little bit of a small detail. So if you're looking at the model in the picture, going from the bow, head along the bow to what, from a perspective position, looks like it's just after the bridge, but in actuality is pretty much adjacent to it. And you'll see the foremost of the wing-mounted guns now go down, and just above the waterline you'll see what looks like a little chain, or possibly a black line if you're looking at a mobile phone. And then follow that line down and you'll see there is a little hatch. And then if you take a closer look, as I have shown you with this photo, you can see that that hatch that's the cover for the underwater torpedo tube. There's pretty much only one reason to have a hatch of that size below the waterline. And actually, in this same gallery in the National Maritime Museum, they have a model of SMS Emden, which shows similar underwater torpedo tubes. And as you can see here, they are in near enough the same position, actually. So there you go. If you're looking for underwater torpedo tubes, this is the kind of artifact you're looking for on a large model. And also, while it's not necessarily always going to be in this position, a lot of ships that do have broadside underwater torpedo tubes, this is roughly the area of the ship, just underneath the forward bridge superstructure, where you want to start looking. B. Griffin asks, what is the truth to the claim that Rome's voracious appetite for timber to build the fleets of the Punic Wars caused the denuding of southern Italy, and thus the degradation of its soil such that it became much poorer agriculturally, and thus the enfeeblement of that region we know today? Well, whilst it probably didn't help, I don't think specifically the Punic Wars fleets are responsible for the deforestation of the whole of southern Italy. We know of deforestation events in various areas caused by the demand for timbers for ships that were being built en masse in various time periods, obviously in antiquity and closer to now. But the thing is that forests over time, and we're talking over hundreds of years, do have the capacity to regenerate themselves. And that's even with relatively poor soil, which is often left behind as the result of deforestation and then intensive use. So looking at the UK, for example, when the Romans arrived in what's now England, they noted it was incredibly heavily forested. Over time, as the population increased and demand for wood for shipbuilding, but also for fuel, for home construction, etc., increased, England was pretty much deforested until you got just before the Black Death. There was actually less forest, as far as we can tell from what I've read. There was less forest just before the Black Death in England than there is now, because obviously people were using wood considerably more per capita than we do these days. And then the Black Death came, population massively declined, forests grew back, and then forests were cut down again as England became a naval power in the Age of Sail, and then forests grew back again because now you're working with iron and steel, etc. And then you get to the modern era where people are looking at, oh, well, we should maybe conserve these things. So if southern Italy had been completely stripped of trees, in a maximal case, to supply the ships of the Punic Wars, that might have caused some problems, but by about the 2nd century AD, you'd be looking at everything having regrown, or a good portion of it. And obviously that's a long time ago comparative to now. So whilst the demands for shipping for the Punic Wars may have caused significant deforestation in southern Italy, the fact that the area remained deforested and the soil gradually degraded would have been more a symptom of ongoing demand for timber. But so obviously shipbuilding, as Rome tried to maintain its fleets at various points, but also how home construction, general materials for building things like, peeler shafts, etc., fuel, and also use of the land for agriculture as the population grew. And that persistent maintaining of the deforestation would have then led to gradual soil degradation and various issues. And obviously once soil degradation falls past a certain point, it's much, much harder for forests to recover. But also you have the problem of, if the soil degrades and you're trying to support a population and you're not getting the crop yields, then people start to expand and the agricultural and pastoral areas even further in an attempt to bulk up the food supplies, which just leads to a cyclical problem. Dakis CZ asks, what was the reason that 6-inch dual-purpose guns were not implemented during the interwar period? Well, it wasn't for lack of trying. In fact, with the County class, they even tried for 8-inch dual-purpose guns. But fundamentally, the problem with trying to do 6-inch or 8-inch dual-purpose weapons in the interwar period was weight. Weight of the shells, particularly. And that's because at the time, there's still a huge amount of manual effort involved in loading these shells, especially at high angles. And the human body can only lift and maneuver a certain amount of weight at certain distances from the sort of the core. If you've worked in any kind of manual labor these days, you'll know about all sorts of fancy health and safety instructions that talk about, you should only lift up to 10 kilos with your arms extended and up to 20 kilos with your arms close up to your chest. I'm not entirely sure who came up with those. I can understand maybe in a general case, but a generally fit adult human can lift a little bit more than that. Maybe not on an ongoing basis, day in, day out, forever and a day, and still remain entirely healthy, which may be what they're based on, but nevertheless, little digression there. But essentially, and this was the same problem they had trying to come up with secondary guns generally, the bigger the shell, obviously the more destructive it is, but the heavier it is, the harder it is to maneuver, and therefore the slower your rate of fire. And that's just with, surface guns, guns designed to shoot at destroyers and so forth. With the anti-aircraft development and dual-purpose weapons, high angles of elevation means you're not just having to pick the thing up and pop it down on a tray. You're potentially having to pick the thing up, tilt it, place it, and support it on a tray, and possibly even be called in some guns to actually help ram it home. And of course, the effort needed if you have hydraulic rammers to shove a 6-inch shell sideways, or near enough sideways if it's at 5, 10, 20 degrees elevation. A lot of that weight is being supported on the tray and in the gun, whereas if the gun is now elevated at 70 degrees because it's trying to shoot down an incoming aircraft, you're essentially having to deadlift almost all of that weight on the rammer, and that also is a limitation. On a larger scale, that this is one of the reasons why battleship guns, generally speaking, can't actually reload at all angles. There are a few battleship guns that are designed to do this, but even the ones that were designed to do that didn't usually do it, or couldn't actually really do it fully at all elevations, although they could do it at significantly higher elevations than others, because of this issue of how much weight are you actually asking the rammer to shove. It's the same reason why, for example, some of the world's strongest men can pull a 747 but only lift a car. And so despite people trying repeatedly to invent 6-inch dual-purpose weapons because they thought this would be the ideal heavy anti-shipping caliber and also provide a fairly hefty flak burst for the shells, it just didn't work out until you got in the latter part of the Second World War, and immediately thereafter you got ships like Worcester in the US and Tiger in the UK, where they eventually managed to include much stronger autoloaders, much stronger mechanical loaders period, which then became autoloaders, which then took away much of the human element as well as just being stronger mechanically, and they are essentially the things that enable the 6-inch dual-purpose weapon. And then we have, was there a design for a unified battery warship in the Age of Sail? In other words, a ship carrying all of one certain pound of gunshot, and if not, why? There was actually, and this idea cropped up repeatedly during the Age of Sail, but one of the earliest ships that could be said to have a unified main battery was Vasa. Now, you can perhaps see where I'm going with this one. Now, Vasa had a few other issues, like her hull being a little bit too narrow, but if you've watched the series that we've done on Vasa previously, you'll know that one of the contributory factors to Vasa going over sideways was the fact that she was entirely armed with 24-pounder cannon on both gun decks. And it turned out that for a ship of her size and with that number of guns, having 24-pounders on the upper gun deck didn't help with her stability issues. And this was fundamentally the problem that multi-decked ships of the line faced during the Age of Sail. You wanted to have fairly hefty guns to do the most damage, which usually towards the end of the Age of Sail had stabilised at either a 32 or 36-pounder, depending if you were French, Spanish, British, etc. But something in that range. They had been experiments with 42s earlier, but they turned out to be a bit too heavy. But if you had a 3-decker ship of the line and you tried to put, 6-ton, 32-pounder long guns on every single deck, you just roll over and sink, even with the fairly extreme tumble home that some ships of the line had. And so, in an effort to counter this, you end up with 32, let's say in a British ship of the line, you have 32-pounders, then 24-pounders, and then depending on the time period, either 12 or 18-pounders. And they're all long guns, which means that, approximately speaking, your broadside can reach out to a unified given distance, and then, obviously, that means you could engage in a line battle. The problem with having a unified battery at that point was that either you would have to significantly downsize the guns you have on your lower gun decks, which is going to reduce your broadside battery, which is obviously not a good thing because it means your ship is now less effective against other ships, including perhaps ships smaller than it. Or if you don't want to roll over, you have to use progressively shorter and shorter barrel weapons, which therefore weigh less and would have an equivalent weight to a long gun of a smaller caliber. And in theory, that would allow you to have a unified shot for your whole battery, but the restriction would be that only your lower gun deck could reach out to full range. And eventually, this is actually what was done. And the reason you've got USS Pennsylvania, the US Navy's only first-rate ship of the line up, is because the US Navy was actually one of the leading pioneers of this idea in the aftermath of the War of 1812 with its 74 gunners and later the Pennsylvania as well. And the idea was also then adopted into various other navies, including the Royal Navy. And what this did was essentially, you have your 32-pounder long gun on your lower gun deck. In the case of a first rate, you then have a shorter barrel 32-pounder on the middle gun deck. So it would have slightly less charge, slightly less range, slightly less hitting power, but it wasn't a carronade just yet. And then on the upper gun deck, you would have an even shorter barrel 32-pounder, and in some cases, quite often, these would actually be reboard 24-pounders. And then on the upper decks, i.e. not the main gun decks, you would have 32-pounder carronades. And as I said, this idea meant you had absolutely monstrous close-in firepower. So if you're fighting a Battle of Trafalgar-style engagement as the British, where you're getting up close and personal, this is a brilliant broadside to have. Whereas if you're fighting a longer-range engagement, let's say you're on the Franco-Spanish side of Trafalgar and you're bombarding the enemy ships as they come in, it's a less optimal broadside to have, because you'll only be able to engage at long range with one gun deck. And of course, it does leave you somewhat vulnerable, because if an enemy vessel has a mixed battery, but all long guns, then in theory, if they can keep the range open, they can shoot at you with, if we're looking at, say, 120 gun ship of the line, they can shoot at you with about 60 guns, not counting the additional ones they've stuck on there, and you can only reply with maybe 15 or so from your lower gun deck. That's obviously not brilliant, but that depends on people keeping the range open. So if everyone's gone that way, it doesn't really matter quite so much. And so you have a brief period in the 1820s, 1830s, where people were going for this unified 32-pounder main battery in Britain and the States, and slightly different calibers in various other countries. And then shell guns come in and ruin it all, because people start supplementing with shell guns of various calibers, and it's no longer a unified main battery. Feralian asks, did any navies deploy any rated ships that acted as tenders for resupply or repairs to other rated ships, or was it just easier to rely on ports around the planet? Whilst there wasn't a specific rate that was used as a tender or resupply vessel, very often such a thing was actually done, usually with either older ships that were no longer considered combat worthy, so a lot of 50, 54, 64 gunner ships towards the end of the Age of Sail met that fate, or perhaps a ship which had been captured in battle and was still floatable, it wasn't going to sink anytime soon, but perhaps the cost of repairing and refitting it to bring it back into service was not seen as economical at the time, either because the Navy was short of cash or because they just thought, well, we've got more than enough of this type of ship. And so in those cases, those vessels sometimes would be deployed as guard vessels, but very often would be deployed to either supplement port facilities or to, in some cases, become port facilities for a while to act as tender and resupply to other vessels. So if you look at a fair number of 19th century paintings, especially in the middle of the 19th century, kind of 1840 through to 1870, you'll notice small ships of the line and frigates very often in a dismasted condition being used as tenders and resupply points for all sorts of things. There's a rather famous painting or engraving of the SS Great Eastern with an old single gun deck frigate next to it as a tender, and the thing is absolutely dwarfed by the Leviathan that is the Great Eastern, ironically enough, given the original name of that ship. So yes, they were used, and obviously if you have a very, what you might call an austere port, so if you are planning to conduct a campaign in a region and you're like, well, this harbour is an absolutely brilliant harbour, make an excellent base of operations, it's just, a few hours sailing away from where we want to be fighting, but there's no real civilization there, then one of the things you can do is sail a bunch of old ships there as well, and have them moored up as tenders and resupply points. The other advantage that this has is that a lot of the time, this kind of photo aside, age of sail ships didn't really come, at least the big ones, come right up to the dockside very often. They would more often anchor out in the harbour, and supplies and men would have to be ferried to and from them in small boats, partly because of the difficulties of manoeuvring such a ship alongside, and as well as maintaining depth off of a dockside, etc. Whereas if you have a resupply tender that's moored out in deeper water, you can get a lot closer to that to take supplies, etc. on board. And then we have, it seems that throughout history, the biggest obstacle to the size and capabilities of a navy's vessels, especially its capital ships, is dry dock and canal sizes. So logically, the simplest solution is to expand these pieces of infrastructure first. Yet it always seems that throughout the time period in history the Channel covers, every nation would rather do anything else. Why? What makes the expansion of dry docks and canals such a painful pill to swallow? And what does it take for the various nations of the time period the Channel covers to actually get on and do it? Partly, it's just cost. If you're going to build a ship, that involves quite a lot of cost already, but if your building of a ship involves also having to extend your infrastructure, those additional costs tend to make people in the treasury cry into their cornflakes. But it's also a matter of scale, because it's not just a case of, okay, well, we will expand this bit of infrastructure. The problem is, if you're going to set a new standard for the size of your capital ship and you need to expand your infrastructure to build that, well, if you want to build more than one ship at a time, that means you have to expand more than one slipway at a time. And if you're going to do that, then you ideally want quite a few different slipways expanded, if for no other reason than, if you've established this new standard and let's say you decide we're going to build 4 ships simultaneously, you expand 4 slipways, well, now the owners of those 4 slipways now have a stranglehold on capital ship contracts, which may not work out for you really well in the long term. Then you've also got to expand the dry docks to take the ships when they need maintenance, and for a navy that's mostly based at home, that may not be too much of a problem, but you're probably going to need to expand 4, 5, 6, 7 dry docks, realistically. If you are a navy with significant overseas commitments, like the British Empire, then it gets a lot more scary, because you need to have at least, if you're going to build, like say with the G3s and N3s, so let's say you're building 8 ships, you're going to need at least 2 to 4 dry docks at home so that you can handle 2 to 4 hulls at any one time, because it's not just peacetime maintenance you have to worry about, it's also about what if they get damaged in wartime. And you've got to repeat that process on a smaller scale at your various other outposts. Gibraltar, Malta, Singapore, etc. You're going to need at least 1 dry dock in each of those areas expanded. And suddenly you're looking at expanding a dozen plus dry docks and 6 to 8 slipways. That's a lot of money to build 1 or 2 classes of ship. And you also then run into the problem of, okay, we're doing that for this set of capital ships, but what about the next set? Are they going to be larger? Are we going to have to go through this whole rigmarole again? And if so, then you do what I've usually advocated for, is actually just do a very, very considerable extension, because that future-proofs you against having to do it in the future for a while. But then obviously that's a lot of upfront cost, because extending your slipway by, let's say, 50 feet and expanding all your dry docks by 50 feet, that's going to cost a certain amount. If you say, actually, we're going to expand everything by 200 feet because 15 years down the line we might be building ships that are that much longer than our current ones, that's a huge amount of additional upfront cost. And again, trying to persuade most politically guided offices like treasuries of various governments that long-term planning might be a thing, well, unfortunately, long-term planning past the next election cycle is almost anathema to politicians, and unfortunately these days in a lot of the private infrastructure world as well. Although for them, they're mostly thinking in terms of their next golden parachute or that financial year's stock report. Because, and again, this is something of a flaw with people being very selfish and short term. If you are, let's say, the CEO of the Clydebank Shipyards, which you can see here, if you turn around and say, well, sorry, everyone, you're not getting, all you investors, you're not getting any dividends this year because we invested colossal amounts of money in massively expanding our shipbuilding facilities, but you will get considerably better returns for the next 2 or 3 decades because we'll be pretty much the premier shipbuilding facility in the UK. Whilst, if you look at the cold hard sums, that's actually a massive net win for the shareholders. Unfortunately, an awful lot of shareholders will stamp their feet and scream and whine, but I want my money now. Algernon needs to go to private school this year, and I spent last year's massive dividends on opium. So you're doing a bad job. And if they're in positions of power on the board, they'll stop you from making that expansion. Which, yeah, people suck, generally. But then you also have even larger infrastructure issues, which is you may not be able to easily or at all expand the infrastructure. So what you can't quite see in this particular photo of Hood under construction is that there's a tributary river off to the other side, and that is what allows Hood to be launched safely. You couldn't necessarily expand all of these slipways to build a ship the size of Hood and actually launch it safely. So you may then have to look at either relocating your shipyards, which are massively expensive, or you may have to look at digging out massive tranches of the opposite riverbank if you're a shipyard on a river. And the other thing is literally at the other end, as you can see with Hood here, where she's overlapped the supply road, the supply railway train, and kind of inserted her bow in between the buildings, is that shipyards tend to build up infrastructure around them. And if you're trying to expand inland, there's maybe an awful lot of infrastructure that you need to relocate there. So buildings, walkways, railways, etc., etc. And you may not own enough land going further inland to actually relocate all those things within that section of the shipyard. So there are a lot of obstacles to overcome when it comes to massively expanding dockyard infrastructure. But on the other hand, this is part and parcel of what comes with being a big naval power. And at the end of the day, as a government that is looking at these things, you have to face a choice. If you wish to remain competitive and have yourself taken seriously on the global stage, you have to bite the bullet and invest. And if you're going to bite the bullet and invest in all this infrastructure, then the best approach is to bite the bullet in a really big way and invest in massively expanded infrastructure so you don't have to repeat the exercise every 2 or 3 years. But that would require long-term thinking, which is why people dig their heels in and it usually doesn't happen, and you get all sorts of weird and wonderful solutions, like in this case building a battle cruiser whose bows are obscuring the windows of somebody's office, or in the French case building a battleship which you have to attach the bow and stern to after you've launched it, etc., etc., etc. The forbidden left hand of Beatty, formerly known as Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harikaze, asks, my local bus company has introduced new buses that audibly announce each stop as it comes along. One of the stops in the town of Beverley, Yorkshire, has the name Admiral Walker Road, and having never heard of him before, I googled him and could only discover that he died in 1925 and that he ended up as a Rear Admiral in the Royal Navy. Is there any chance you can tell me more about this gentleman and his career, as a visit to the local history centre surprisingly provided nothing apart from a picture of his memorial? Now, this one did take a bit of digging, because for a while I thought the only thing I was going to be able to tell you was that in the will and probate section of the National Archives, it describes him as leaving £32,000 in his will, which in 1925 was a lot of money. However, I'm happy to report that I did manage to track down a little bit more information about him. Specifically, I managed to track down the obituary that was published about him when he died. So For lack of anything better, I shall just read out his long-form obituary, because it presents a fairly good summary in the time we have for a dry dock answer of his career. So it says, born on February the 6th, 1836, in the reign of King William IV, Admiral Walker was the third son of Sir James Walker, who was created a baronet in 1868. The Admiral lived to see the baronetcy pass to 3 generations, for he was a brother of Sir J.R. Walker, 2nd Baronet, uncle of Sir J.H. Walker, 3rd Baronet, and great-uncle of Sir R.J.M. Walker, the 4th and present Baronet, obviously that in 1925. He entered the Navy on January the 4th, 1850, on board the Phaeton, a 50-gun ship, Captain George Elliot commanding, and served as a midshipman in the Black Sea during the war with Russia, being awarded the Crimean and Turkish medals and clasp for Sevastopol, so he was in the Crimean War. Off this port on September 15, 1855, he performed a gallant feat of life-saving for which he was awarded the Silver Medal of the Royal Humane Society. He jumped overboard in a heavy sea and rescued an able seaman named Cullis, with whom he then swam to a launch. He became a sub-lieutenant in January 1856 and a lieutenant in February 1858. On June 17, 1862, he was appointed to the screw frigate Euryalus, a flagship in China of Vice Admiral Sir Augustus Cooper, for disposal, and while in her saw considerable service against pirates in China. For this, he was promoted to commander in November 1864 at the early age of 28. After further duty of an uneventful character, he was advanced to captain in December 1871, and 2 years later he retired, being promoted to Rear Admiral on the retired list on January 1st, 1888. Rear Admiral Walker was married in 1873, the year of his retirement from the Navy, to Edith Francis, daughter of Admiral the Honourable Arthur Duncombe of Kilnwick, Percy, Yorkshire. She died in 1906, having had 2 sons, of whom one, Mr. Edgar W. Walker, became a barrister, and as a captain of 3rd Battalion East Yorkshire Regiment was killed in action in October 1914. The other, the Reverend Philip C. Walker, is rector of Lockington. The Admiral was a Justice of the Peace for the East Riding of Yorkshire, which means he was technically Justice of the Peace around the time my great-grandfather was in that area. Weirdly enough. A correspondent writes, Admiral Walker was a man of very generous disposition, and in addition to his numerous private benefactions, he was very munificent in his public and charitable gifts, which included reading rooms, a public fountain, and a miniature rifle range. Is that the rifle range is very small, or it uses very small rifles? Which was at one time the largest in the country, having a shooting distance of 100 yards, so probably using small rifles, I'm going to guess, and was used for annual competitions of the National Miniature Rifle Association. Since the war, it has been adapted for use as a school clinic. He took no part in the municipal life of the town of Beverley, but he was a trustee of a number of charitable bodies and was also a Justice of the Peace for the East Riding, as we've already mentioned, etc., etc. It goes on a little bit about personal friendships and his politics, but I think that is probably as good a summary as any. Sebastian asks, would the Italian Aquila and Spaviero carriers decisively change things in the Mediterranean theatre if they'd somehow been completed for the start of the war or even in 1941? Changed things, yes. Decisively, probably not. And I say that because whilst if we sort of handwave somehow that they get completed in time for Italy, when Italy joins the war or whatever, that's not going to change the fact that the more capable aircraft that they were eventually planning on using just aren't available at that time period. So you'd have to crash course some current Italian fighter aircraft or bomber, something like that, to be the air group for the first couple of years. So, if you're lucky, something like a G50, which the Fiat G50 is, it's an okay-ish fighter. It suffers from the fact it really is not very heavily armed at all. Honestly, performance spec-wise, the Fulmar probably wouldn't have too many problems dealing with it. And, yeah, so given the fact that in the central Mediterranean, at least, the Royal Navy was already coming under concerted attack from the Regia Aeronautica, adding a handful of additional lighter weight strike aircraft and fighters probably isn't going to change a huge amount there. Where it could make a difference. And it's obviously it's not going to make a difference in the round. In the whole campaign, the Italian Navy is still going to lose. So, yeah, if you're looking for a decisive change, I'm afraid you need to look on a little bit of a grander scale. But detailed engagements, especially when the Italian fleet ventures out beyond the initial coverage of the Regia Aeronautica, those might change. I mean, you might have, the Royal Navy devoting more carriers or rushing the development of better fighters. In any case, so Sea Hurricanes for the start, and then Martlets and so forth. But for example, in the campaign that leads up to the Battle of Matapan, the Swordfish that is dispatched after the Italian force that obviously damages Vittorio Veneto and cripples Pola, those are Swordfish and Blenheims coming from shore, which only have to contest with Italian anti-aircraft fire. Now, if either Aquila or Spaviero was there and was able to put up any kind of fighter defence, that forces the Royal Navy to send in sweeps of Fulmars or whatever other fighters they have available first to try and tangle up an Italian combat air patrol and suppress it, and then the Swordfish go in. Otherwise, they risk the Swordfish being engaged by the Italian fighters, which might happen anyway, and that might disrupt the attack, which then may or may not prevent Pola from being crippled, which then may or may not lead to the Battle of Cape Matapan actually happening at night the way that it historically did. So I think Aquila and Spaviero have the capability to change individual engagements, although of course the flip side is they will be priority targets for the Royal Navy as well. Vokir asks, a paraphrased question from my little cousin: how accurate are the depictions of the submarine, sea mines and torpedo in Finding Nemo? Well, the mines are your sort of generic spiky sea mines. They've got a few too many and a few too large Hertz horns for most mines of the time. There are one or two Hertz horn spherical mines that would look somewhat like this, but again, the spikes, the Hertz horns, are a little bit overdone. But otherwise, you can see the chain and the sea anchor and everything. They're actually not half bad, and the fact they've got the submarine sunk in the middle of the minefield, presumably by the minefield, isn't too bad a shout either. Albeit, if it was me being really, really nitpicky, I'd say the minefield is set far too deep. There should be a good chunk of the mines much closer to the surface on longer chains. And also, of course, they're far, far, far too close together. But that's again artistic license. The torpedo, it's a torpedo. It's a cylinder. It's got some rather nice counter-rotating propellers at the back. Possibly a little bit too modern of a propeller setup for the kind of period of submarine that's being depicted. But as a generic torpedo, it's not half bad. And then the submarine itself is fairly easily identifiable as a World War II American submarine, probably a Gator or a Balao. There are a few artistic details which are slightly wrong, like the fact later on when you see the bow torpedo tubes, there are only 4 tubes instead of the 6 that you would find on a Gator or a Balao. But obviously all the wording is in English, the lettering on the side is in English, so it's definitely either a British or an American submarine. And it has a completely unrecognizable number, because when you see the number, it's something faded C-22. Possibly there's a rust patch afterwards, maybe that's 220 something. But although there are some 220 series Gatos that didn't make it back, the US obviously doesn't prefix their submarines with something C, presumably SC or something like that. So, minor little details like that, but broadly speaking, it's fairly recognizable fairly quickly as a World War II period American submarine, which is rather interesting in and of itself, because again, it continues the trend of, although in this case the accuracy is a little bit off, as we just mentioned, it does continue the trend of movies which are not purporting to be historical movies, actually including stuff that is far more historically accurate than movies that sometimes claim to be historical movies and get things horrifically wrong. Ibareg asks, would it be possible to call the Battle of Cape Engano a Japanese victory, given that the Northern Force did complete their objective? I wouldn't necessarily call it a Japanese victory. I mean, they did get a bunch of their ships sunk, and, well, a decoy force is supposed to be a decoy force. That doesn't necessarily presuppose getting a bunch of your ships sent to the bottom. Plus, you've also got to remember that, ironically enough, of the three forces that the Japanese sent out for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Ozawa's force, the Northern Force, the decoy one, that was the one the Americans were supposed to see coming and focus on it, and therefore miss the other two. And as it turned out, the Americans spotted the Southern and Center forces long before they spotted the Northern Force, which then led to the Battle of Sibuyan Sea and the loss of Musashi before anything could actually be done. And, well, the US subs, plugging away, taking out Otago, etc. as well didn't help matters. But once you get to, okay, now Ozawa's forces have actually been spotted and the US is coming north, the point of the sacrifice of the Northern Force was supposed to be to allow the Southern and Centre forces to do their job. And as we know, the Southern Force was completely destroyed, and Kurita kind of, Taffy 3 dealt with Kurita. So, as a decoy to enable something else to happen, well, that other thing didn't happen. Maybe that's not necessarily entirely Ozawa's fault. But the other factor is that, yes, they were very short on aircraft. They only had just over 100 aircraft between all the carriers. But again, you could have done better, I think, than expend most of them uselessly attacking the American fleet, which you knew was probably hiding to nothing in the first place. If it was up to me and I was, in Ozawa's position, then even if we chalk up Sibuyan Sea and all the other stuff and not being spotted themselves to just circumstance, rather than loading up precious strike aircraft onto the carriers, I would have loaded up maybe a dozen strike aircraft using, the Judies, those really, really irritating strike aircraft that seem able to bypass American defenses in ones and twos, usually by traveling at low level or other shenanigans. And okay, send those out, because ultimately either you get some really weird, Franklin Bunker Hill style attacks in which cause massively disproportionate damage, or it fails, but you've only lost a dozen aircraft. So that's, it's not necessarily a win-win, but it's certainly not a massive loss either way. And then the other roughly 100 or so aircraft, just have fighters, because the Americans are coming for you. That's the whole point of the decoy force. You equally know, or should know, that the strike element that you have aboard historically isn't really going to accomplish all that much. But even with the fact the Americans have more, and in many cases better aircraft, if you can put up 100 fighters to defend yourself, you can probably inflict some reasonable casualties on the American dive and torpedo bombers that are coming after you and chew them up. Now, that's not necessarily quite as nice as, taking out a carrier or two, but you're unlikely to do that anyway, short of, as I said, the aforementioned sneaky Judies. So that's what I would have done, and as a result, I would hesitate to call it a Japanese victory. In terms of, yes, well done, you managed to decoy Halsey, maybe you could call it mission failed successfully. Rebel Skverl asks, after viewing your video on naval logistics again, I think there's one more area to consider: personnel. Would you agree that the need to continuously recruit, train and assign officers and ratings who can perform their duties to an acceptable degree of competency is an often underappreciated role in the ability of a navy to be effective and even dominant at times? Absolutely. Crew are probably the single most important asset for a navy, alongside, actually having the ships in the first place. Because if you have enough men and officers and men, and you've got them all trained up to a decent standard, and they all work together pretty well, that is easily worth, half a generation of technological advantage, or a few extra ships here and there. Because, well, the biggest, longest case in point, I think, would be the Napoleonic Wars. Because when you look at the ships being produced by both sides, quite often French and Spanish ships were bigger in many cases were much more heavily armed than British ships. Now, that's not necessarily to say that British ships were entirely inferior. As I've mentioned before, British ships tended to be more maneuverable, and British ships also tended to have a lot more staying power out at sea before they'd start working themselves loose and had to go back into port. So, there are qualitative advantages on both sides there. But ultimately, if a British fleet has been sitting off your coastline for 6 months and you've been in port, resting your ships, and then you come out in that kind of straight up line battle, theoretically, ship for ship at similar rates, a Franco-Spanish fleet should normally throw a bit more metal per broadside and sail a little bit faster, which is a technological advantage in the fixed case of a battle. But the fact that the British fleet generally was full of veteran sailors who knew what they were doing, and the Franco-Spanish fleet usually wasn't, meant that what could otherwise have been a slight qualitative edge for the Franco-Spanish fleets turned into an environment where the Royal Navy was winning 90+% of the engagements. And the need to continuously maintain the numbers of men is also very important, because otherwise you can end up in a very destructive cycle, which is not unique to navies. It's happened in places that I've worked. I've seen it happen in other companies and other organizations that have worked with companies or organizations that I've worked with, and I'm sure many of you guys have experienced the same thing, where you can have the best workforce, but if high command, whoever that happens to be, whether that be an admiralty, management, CEO, board of directors, etc., if they cut the numbers of available people, either directly or through lack of recruitment, down to below a level at which there's enough people to do all the jobs, then various people will start having to do multiple jobs. They'll burn out, they'll leave, and then whoever's left has to take on the job that original person was supposed to be doing, plus the job that they'd adopted. So then now someone else is doing 3 persons jobs, and eventually they'll burn out and leave, and then the next person down the line has to do 4 persons jobs, and very, very quickly, obviously, it becomes unsustainable, and you get a death spiral of competent people going, why should I do 3 people's jobs here for minimal pay and poor conditions when I can go to another organization who will pay me more with the skills and experience I've picked up here, and will only make me do 1 job? That's a fairly big issue. And part of the ability to recruit, train, and then utilize officers and men in a navy is, offering them a decent amount of pay, decent accommodations, and where perhaps you can't necessarily stretch to particularly generous pay or particularly generous accommodation, you can at least stretch to offering them some other kind of incentive. And when navies fail to do that, usually, although not always because of political interference, you end up with aforementioned death spirals, and that could be extremely bad if it's not caught very quickly. And finally, Sam Signorelli asks, how long in advance before firing could you load an Age of Sail cannon without degradation of the powder charge, since it would no longer be in its protective storage unit and may be subject to moisture in the air? Unfortunately, this is one of those questions which is kind of like, how long is a piece of string? Because it vastly depends on the conditions that you are facing. So if you're in a relatively stable climate zone that's sort of warmish and dry, maybe you're blockading the coast of Spain or something like that, and the weather is fine, then you could potentially have your powder bag loaded and put your ball and everything on top of that, and it might be good for days. Conversely, if you have also primed it, so you've poked a hole in the bag, and it's cold and miserable and wet and damp, and maybe the gun is on the lowest gun deck, and for whatever reason, maybe either the gun port's a little bit leaky, or you have to keep the gun port open because you're in battle and the waves aren't quite high enough to justify closing it, but you are getting a lot of splash and spray coming in. And obviously some of that might be going down the barrel, soaking through the wadding, etc., etc. Well, at that point, then your powder charge might become pretty much inoperable or very low order in a matter of hours. Possibly even sooner if you're really unlucky with the waves. And as inferred from that, even if you're in rough weather, if let's say you're on a first-rate ship of the line, preloading a gun on your upper enclosed gun deck is probably going to have its charge last a lot longer than a gun on the lowest gun deck or a gun in the upper open exposed areas. Whereas in a very hot, possibly humid environment, but one where there's perhaps a little bit of a breeze, then maybe being on a quarter-deck gun or a poop-deck gun might actually be the best alternative, because it'll be warm, but the breeze will hopefully keep the moisture levels down a little bit compared to being inside the ship proper. So hopefully from that you can glean it's a very moving target. And that's it for this week, everybody. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video, because it's time for me to skedaddle.